Hello and welcome to the Potential Psychology Podcast. I'm your host, Ellen Jackson, and it's my mission to share the science of human behaviour in a practical, fun and inspiring way. In each podcast episode, I interview an expert from the fields of psychology, well-being, leadership, parenting or high performance. I pick their brain to uncover what they know about living well, what tips do they have for you and I quiz them about how they apply their expertise in their own life. Join me as we discover simple, science-backed ways to live, learn, flourish, and fulfill your potential. Hello, you are listening to the Potential Psychology Podcast, and I am Ellen, your host. And I'm super excited about today's episode because I feel like I'm bringing you a meeting of minds. I hope you feel that way by the end of this episode. I hope the energy is obvious in this conversation. I met today's guest, Tess Walton, at an event held by PFAO, the People Analytics and the Future of Work, who are our sponsor for today's episode. And it was at an event that they held late last year in Melbourne. It was one of those very cool, very Melbourne experiences where you climb the stairs at the back of a busy downtown Spanish bar, an eatery, with absolutely delicious food, I have to say, in Melbourne CBD, in one of those laneways, and you have no idea what to expect. Or I certainly had no idea what to expect because I'd never been to one of these events before. And then I spent a few hours in a kind of edgy exposed brick and cool lighting function room having the most amazing conversations with the most amazingly smart and interesting people. And one of those people was Tess. I was introduced to her and we just clicked straight away. We got talking about her specialist topic, which is the future of work. And I quickly realised that this was absolutely a podcast episode in the making. So it took us a little while to coordinate schedules. It is now February, but we connected last week for this conversation, which really weaves and wends its way through a whole lot of topics, but all focused on the future. How do we create the future? What could it look like? What skills and what kind of thinking do we need to get there? How does working with the leaders of large organisations to visualise and create the future parallel the work that I do with individuals in living our best life? And how do we get curious about everything? It was just so much fun and I walked away so full of energy, and I'm really sure that you will too once you've listened in. And if you do love this conversation and you're interested in learning more from Tess, she is one of the speakers at the PFAO Sydney 20 event, which is being held on the 3rd and 4th of March 2020 at the Amora Hotel Jamison in Sydney's CBD. And I'm super excited that I get the chance to connect with her again at that event. And I'm also excited at the prospect of more amazing conversations and amazing learning from the PFAO community. So if the mini Melbourne event late last year is anything to go by, it is going to be mind-blowing, if slightly exhausting, couple of days. But you can find out more at PFAO, PAFOW.net. And if you're interested in attending, if you're in Sydney and this sounds like your bag and you'd like to attend the event, you'll hear Tess speak, you'll hear me speak, you'll hear lots of people speak. It'll be very cool. You can find out more, I said that, at pafao.net. You can also register at pafao.net, so PAFOW.net. And we do have a special promo discount code for you as well. So you'll get $200 off the price of your registration using the promo code SYD200. So that's SYD in capitals and then the numerals 200, 200. I hope to see you there. But I think now it's time to get chatting to strategic workforce planning expert and shaper of the future of work, Tess Walton. With me today is Tess Walton, founder of Talent Risk Management and Strategic Workforce Planner. And Tess's passion and expertise is in helping workplaces to think differently about jobs and employment. Her clients, with her help, embrace the diversity of age and experience and attitudes, as well as ethnicity and gender in our community to package work differently. Tess is joining me today to talk about shaping the future of work, exploring what work can and might look like in the decades to come. And I hope giving us some tips on how we can prepare ourselves and our kids for ways of working that are changing rapidly. Welcome, Tess.
Thanks, Ellen. Great to be here.
It's lovely to have you here. Now, you call yourself a shaper of the future of work. What exactly does that mean? Because it sounds intriguing.
It does sound intriguing. I agree. And let me confess that in actual fact, I came across it as a title someone had in an organisation as workforce shaper. And I thought, oh, I like that. So I aspire to shape the future of work, I should say. And really it is about enabling organisations and people to actually be ready for the future. And there's ways in which to do that. And that's what I focus on bringing.
So you're working with what sort of organisations? Who's interested in doing this kind of work?
Yeah, well, the smallest organisation I've actually worked with was 50 employees. So that's quite small. That probably tends to be a unique end of the scale. The majority of organisations I tend to work with are the corporates and all levels of government, from local government, state to federal. And then, as I mentioned, your corporates. Now, when I'm talking about corporates, the banks, utilities, retail, manufacturing. I've probably done a little bit of everything in the majority of industries and in different locations, which has been great. So clearly focusing on the Australian market, but when you're talking about Australia, it doesn't take much to leap into the New Zealand market. And then there's been a lot of work in the US, and that's where I've worked with the largest organisations I've worked with. The largest being Starbucks, and you can imagine we're talking hundreds of thousands of employees in those instances.
So these are big organisations. They've got responsibility for a lot of staff. What is it that drives their engagement with you? What are they looking for, and why? I suppose, why are they thinking about the future of work?
I think organisations want to be future ready. And interesting enough, so do us, as in people. I mean, if you actually look at it, what drives us is to ensure that we've got employability. And organisations need a workforce in order to be able to execute their business strategy. So I think there's that element that's the fundamental as to why they need to do this. But I think the other is change. The fact that we've got words around us like disruption and the future, what does it hold? We've got technology and change. And so there's a lot of these trends that are forcing organisations to be different, to actually run their businesses differently. And in order to do that, they need a workforce that actually does things differently as well. And I think, that kind of boils it down to the fact that they need that sustainability and they need to make a difference. And as I said, from the perspective of employees and people, we want to work. We need to work. And it's a relationship. It's an ecosystem. Organisations can't exist without us being customers, consumers, and workers. And as a result, there is that relationship that exists. And organisations have got a key role in making sure that the society is able to be successful, as is the economies in which they operate. And I think that's what it kind of wraps up into. It's an ecosystem.
Yeah. So given that we're all in this together, one way or the other, as individuals, and also the organisations there to employ, and as you say, thinking then about their customers, thinking about, what it is they need to be able to produce, how they maintain their profitability, how they stay in business. And that's for obviously our profit-based organisations. You're also working with government organisations, not-for-profits, organisations who still have this need for relationships, even if the underlying drivers are slightly different. What is changing in work? If I often, when I'm talking with clients, I talk about how in order to kind of plan the future, we need to look back and take a step back and do a review. And when I think about my own experience of work, and certainly then looking at my parents' experience of work, a lot has changed in the way we work and the nature of work since, say, the 1970s. Where are we at now, and what's changing, do you think?
There are changes that are different depending on the industry that you're looking at, of course, and or as you made mention of the structure of the organisation, whether it is the not-for-profit, the corporates, the government, and then the other, of course, is geography. So there are a number of nuances, and so you can become a lot more specific and detailed when you're looking at particular parts of the construct and knowing which industry we're speaking to. But having said that, I would say that there are some characteristics that are common amongst all. The low-hanging fruit will be technology and the way in which technology is changing our work. And that's when you start seeing things like digitisation, which is the mix of physical and digital. You're looking at changes where you're seeing augmentation. And again, we hear a lot about augmented intelligence. There is also augmentation of physical. It's not full robotics, but it's partial robotics being used by a human to be able to do things with greater agility than if they were in a machine, but and able to do more than what they'd be able to do by themselves. So you can technology plays a role there. I think the other is that you're starting to see a blurring of the boundaries in terms of what is defined as the work or the jobs and the roles. So you're starting to see what was originally positioned, I suppose, as particular, finite positions with certain qualifications, that they're starting to identify where it is that we don't necessarily need that degree of qualification in order to be able to do the tasks. So examples, some of this is born by necessity from the viewpoint of not enough supply. So a really simple example is doctors and nurses. We know that there's not enough of them. The forecasts are there. So as a result, new work is being created, like the nurse practitioner, so that they don't have to be as fully qualified as a doctor. They are able to do certain tasks that once upon a time would not have been entertained as being done by anyone but the doctor. It also plays out in apprenticeships. Once upon a time, you couldn't do anything until you could, by yourself until you completed your full apprenticeship. You're now starting to see that after the first year, a plumber can do certain things, or first year apprenticeship can actually perform certain tasks solo. So I think, you're starting to see, as I said, this breakdown of professionalism, that it's not, you have to be all the way through something in order to be able to perform those activities. I think the other that we start to see is crowdsourcing. It's no longer the remit of just one person. So it's the collective wisdom of the group. And that in itself is a skill set that we're requiring of our people, that we're not saying, oh, I'm the only one who can solve this. So what's happened is we've had a shift and a change from knowledge being contained by an individual to actually being held by the collective, or in many instances, technology and the knowledge management that comes with that. And I think that's what we're seeing evolve quite significantly, is the way in which people see themselves and the careers and the jobs that they hold. So something that's common in terms of the changing of work from, as you were saying, like that spectrum of our grandparents, our parents, ourselves today and future, is that we used to have what we call an I career with quite a bit of specialisation, and we'd have depth and we'd have specific experiences to that. We've then evolved to what many would consider a T. So you've still got deep vertical of specialisation, but then you've got the horizontal from a breadth perspective. So you might have a breadth of experience in different industries. So it could be the same specialisation, but you've worked in lots of different industries. It could be that you've got a deep specialisation in a particular field of your study or profession. So you could be a generalist to a degree, and then finance, for example, but then you've got a deep specialisation. You're known as the go-to person for treasury, as an example. And then what's starting to evolve now, and I think will be there a lot more for the future, is what we call the pi career. And by pi, I'm referring to the mathematical symbol, so the PI. And for those that aren't quite picturing what that symbol looks like, it's a wavy line that's on the horizontal. Then it's got one line that's a straight vertical, and then another vertical, but it has a little kick up. So why this is important is it's showing movement and I think momentum and flow. So it's saying that at the top you've got that wavy line, and really what it's positioning is that you're changing. So it's not just a straight line like the T of your breadth. It's actually saying, well, I could be working, I'm in constant momentum of change as to what I'm doing in terms of that breadth and the industry. And then you've still got a deep specialisation, but you've also got the second one, which is, again, that kick up, and it's saying that we're changing, so we're constantly needing to change what that might be. And I think that's really that summation, that the jobs that we've had in the past have been evolving. Some of them have been revolution and they don't exist anymore, but a lot of them have actually just been evolving. And I think that's part of what the future shows as well. Some people get concerned that jobs are disappearing. It's not the whole job. Tasks of the jobs are being automated potentially, but they're just changing. It's not that the whole job, in the majority of instances, is disappearing. It's the activities within it. And I think this is one of the important parts when we're thinking about the future of work, is actually breaking up our mindset from being, I can do a job or I hold a role or a position, to these are the bundles of activities or the types of work I can do. And these are the skills that I have to be able to execute on those. And that gives us greater freedom, because if there's a particular type of work that's not needed in the future because it's being automated, it doesn't mean that I don't have a job or a role. It just means there's a particular set of work that I do that's no longer required, but I'm still required to do these other types of work. What am I going to fill that void of what's been replaced with what's new? So I hope that was quite a long answer, and I could keep going, but I won't, because there's just so many elements that are changing in terms of our future work.
Yeah. And I think the words that stood out for me as you were providing us with that explanation were things like the breaking down of roles. So, whilst that has kind of in some ways negative connotations of disintegration, I think really it's it hand in hand with that adaptability, the flexibility, the changing nature. So I'm kind of visualizing a spectrum where, and when I think back to, perhaps the way my grandparents or, grandfathers, because grandmothers weren't working that particular time for me, but, that kind of, you do a job or you earn a qualification or you start at a field and it stays pretty rigid, really. You might work your way up. Not many people moved from profession in those days. You kind of stayed where you were. So, yeah, kind of a rigid, just that vertical in terms of knowledge and vertical, I guess, in terms of progression. And then seeing that change over time, that kind of breaking down to be much more flexible and adaptable. And then, the suggestion, I love that little pie, kind of image. I will put that in the show notes for anybody who wants to kind of get a good look at what that looks like, of the movement in there. So movement and change. So for us as human beings, I'm guessing then that it is about not only just understanding that, because I think that's probably part of it. It's probably not something many people have given much thought to, that work is different and that it does change. We do hear the screaming headlines about, job losses because of robots and all of that. But as you say, perhaps that's more sensationalism than real concern. But we as people that I guess are also going to need to change or be prepared to change. Would that be fair?
Oh, absolutely. And this is where it plays in. It's a mindset. Being okay. And we've all been speaking about for quite some time in business about people needing to be comfortable with change. And I think this kind of gets to the bit about the future of work. If you actually, for many of us, we've got children, and you talk to your children and what they're learning at school and how they're learning at school, it's different from how many we learnt. I mean, the example I use a lot of is when I went to school and I got a reader, I would read words and I had to read what was on the page. But my children, when they were at school, they were asked to read the page, and then we were to ask them, what do you think is going to happen? Where do you think it's going to go? That's interpretation. That's an amazing skill. And we're building that into our future workforce in our children today. That's just one illustration. There are many others where you actually see, mind mapping, the number of children that learn a form of mind mapping at primary school now. Whereas for me, I was already in the workforce when the concept of mind mapping kind of arrived.
I don't think I'd heard it till my 20s probably.
Exactly. So
it was a 90s thing, maybe 80s,
and
90s
we learned
thing.
it. Like you actually went and, okay, what's this? And you went on this program. Whereas for them, you can just see this is naturally how they're thinking. So I think, to your point, in many ways, those that exist in the workforce are actually trying to prepare for a future. But we've already got particular mindsets and biases, consciously and unconsciously, that actually give us an interpretation of the future, which is why one of the most important things that someone like myself working with organisation needs to do is bring stimulus to the business to actually get them to be thinking about differently. Otherwise, what we end up when we're exploring or considering the future quite often is an extrapolation of today rather than an actual design of what the future could be.
So really you're working with minds and hearts and ideas and exploration and brainstorming and all the cool stuff that we like to do here on the show and that I like to do in my work as well. Getting people to think differently.
Absolutely. And as a result, they're not always comfortable with it. So, I've had executive groups, a lot less more recently, but I still recall them a good few years ago, where we had executive groups just say, you're asking us to think about 5 to 10 years out. I'm not even going to be in the workforce then. Why should I be doing this? Or we're not going to be the executive. If you think about government, quite often they say, there could be a change of government. So it's hard for me to actually take that accountability and say, yes, let's have a discussion about the future of work or future of this organisation, let alone the future of work, when I may not be here to execute it. And that short-term thinking is one of the biggest challenges that we have in this space. Yet, as you and I highlighted at the beginning in the opening, organisations exist for the future. People need to work and we want to interact. And our need for work isn't just money and covering off our basic needs. It's the altruistic needs that are there as well for us to feel satisfaction in terms of our life. So there's a lot of forces at play here when you're thinking about it. In the first instance, people see workforce planning as being, I suppose, a framework methodology, even a process that the business needs. But it's a lot more than the actual task or activity of ending up with the workforce plan, because it is about the people. And as you said, that's hearts and minds right from the beginning.
Yeah, so really what you're asking organisations or the clients that you work with, the businesses that you work with, is to think more about the role that they play, both as individuals and also as an organisation in our community, really. So that outward looking, what are you here to serve, which is that meaning and purpose stuff, which I'm sure would thrill some people to their very core, but others would remain very perplexed by.
Exactly. It becomes overwhelming, doesn't it? It's quite challenging. And there's some really interesting research. It was Hamill and Prallard, and they wrote a paper, it's a book, Computing for the Future. And they did this research where they actually asked executive groups, to what degree of time do you spend looking external? Of that time looking external, to what degree are you thinking about the future? And then the overlay of that was, as a group, building a collective view of your future. And rather alarmingly, it was less than 3% of their executive time. That is less than 40 hours a year. And when most people think about the executive, and I use that broadly, again, executive grouping can be any senior leaders, doesn't have to just be in the corporate world. But if you think about what we're thinking our leaders are doing, we're thinking that they're thinking of the future. We're thinking that they're not
we're
just
hoping that.
Exactly. We're hoping that they are. We're not wanting them just to make their decisions to address today. We're actually, I suppose, anticipating or expecting, actually, it's even more than hoping, we're expecting that they're thinking about the future. And as you said, and linking it back to my comment about the ecosystem, it's about their role that they play in society, not just as a provider of incomes and a provider of services and products. We just need to look at the environment. And this is where it starts to get quite big, I suppose. And we've got to be pragmatic. So there's this part where we look at opening the mind, the stimulus of what are some of the elements of the future, and I call that the diverge, but then you converge. So we need to actually look at it I need to broaden it out, need to get you to be thinking exactly like our conversation went, but there still needs to be a pragmatism of, okay, don't overwhelm me to the extent where I'm paralysed of fear of what could be. How can I converge into actually making some decisions about certain things that I need to do?
And that's fascinating because that parallels perfectly with what I might do as a coach working with someone who needs to start thinking about, who wants to start thinking about whether it's a career decision. I often say, well, where do you want to be in 5 years' time? And they give me that same sort of, oh my God, I don't know. And it's like, well, I'm a firm believer that somewhere in our core, we really do know where we want to be, that, we do all have a vision for the future, no matter how fuzzy that vision may be. We've got an idea of what that might look like. It's just that we get all practical about it and go, well, no, but I couldn't do that because, and well, maybe, no, I couldn't do that.
Yes.
And so working between that, how do we actually help people to open their hearts and minds to the idea of the possibilities and being able to kind of park some of that need for practical decision making or the practical limitations just momentarily to get the vision work done.
Yes.
And then come back to exactly as you say, the convergence back to, so what do I do now that I've got this? Because if I can't create the vision and then just be left hanging, I need to kind of know then how do we move forward?
Yes.
So have you got any, because that is hard. What are the kind of, what might be the questions, or what do you posit to a group to get them initially thinking about that vision and those possibilities when their mindset might be, but I'm not going to be here, or I don't know what the government's going to do, or any of that practical stuff?
Yeah. Well, I suppose that there's a couple of things that I'd say. I mean, there's many, but let me stay focused. So one of them is language, and I use the 5 Ps for the future. And you made comment to a number of those Ps just then when you were describing what individuals are thinking. This just helps bring a frame to it. So we've got what we call a probable future. So probable future is where we're basically heading today. So the decisions that I've made, either as an individual or as an organisation, means I'm investing in the following, or I'm doing the following. So it's probable that this is what's going to happen in a particular time frame. We then have what's plausible. And plausible means it's not necessarily something we've invested in to date, but it's got resonance with us. We think, it's plausible I could be this, or it's plausible that as an organisation we could be in this new market, or introducing a new product. It's not probable because we haven't actually made the decision that we're going to do that, so we haven't necessarily put resources, either individually or as an organisation, but we're saying it's plausible. We think it has resonance.
Not outside the realms of possibility.
Correct, exactly. And that's what you were saying. Lots of people kind of bring that possibility in too quickly, or as in realms of possibility. The third is possible future. And basically the positioning here is anything's possible. Anything's possible. Once it's out there, it's possible. It then goes through stages of being plausible and probable, right? And that framework there is starting to help people make decisions from a viewpoint of, am I thinking just of a probable future? And I see businesses, when I've worked with them, talk about that. They'll suddenly start saying, I think we're talking about the probable future, and we actually need to be thinking a little bit beyond what we're already doing. So that helps. Let me cover off the other two. The other is preferred future. So that's meant to be a design of the future unencumbered by what is. So we're actually saying to people, think about what's probable, you're plausible and possible, and then design a preferred future. And then the last one's the planned future, because what your preferred future might actually be too much of a stretch, or there are some issues that you need to address before that preferred future is truly feasible. And so that's where you get into your planning. And typically what we position is that when you're talking about the future, you have to have a time frame in mind. So it's one of the most important parts. Am I talking about next year? Am I talking 3 to 5 years? And that's also where a preferred future and a planned future might differ a little bit, because this might be my preferred future, but I want to achieve it in 3 years. And I've just found out it's probably going to take me 5 years in order to get there. So there's a little bit of interaction. So that's one of the things that we do with the businesses. And I think it can help. I have had people, when I've run a couple of day program, and they'll go home and they'll speak at the dinner table, as often do, and they're sharing, and they come back the next day, I was with my husband and we've now got 5P future. We sat there and spoke about, where are we heading and what do we actually want? And it's been helpful. So that might be one of the things, but it definitely helps organisations with that particular framework.
Yeah, I love that use, as you say, of language, just by putting words to ideas that we can kind of then understand it in a more practical way, or understand it in a way that makes us, it triggers thinking and triggers discussion and triggers ideas. So, I love that. I'm interested to know, this is just a little segue, but it relates to a news story that I heard this morning. How many of the organisations, and I'll tell you why, because I'm pretty sure it was BP, the CEO of BP globally, I might have got that wrong, certainly one of the big petroleum companies, who said that we are going to go carbon neutral. We have a plan. Well, I'm not sure that was actually a plan, but certainly a time frame. And he talked about 30 years. He said in 30 years' time, we will have enacted this plan to be fully carbon neutral. I think that was both in terms of products and supply chain and the whole bit. And when he said 30 years, I was like, wow, how many people are actually planning out? Because I think probably in some things we need to. When it talks about climate change, we need to be thinking that big. So how many of your organisations would actually be even anywhere close to thinking 30 years in advance.
It's surprising how many are.
Okay.
Particularly when you're talking about infrastructure and utilities, they're all doing that, without a doubt. They've got their plans for 30 to be on. I mean, Toyota actually has a 100-year plan.
Okay.
It's a great...
That's very Japanese.
It is very Japanese, right? So, I mean, that's why when we first started, geography and implied by geography, culture, definitely has a dynamic to influencing dynamic on what are organisations doing in this space. Having said that, it's a really great example of their 100-year vision. It's probably a little bit more of a vision than a plan. Actually doesn't have a lot of detail in it. But then its 50-year plan gets a bit more detail. And then the 30-year plan, 20-year, 10-year, 5-year. And this is a great way of us all looking at it, and that framework that I mentioned at the 5 Ps, that you get more detailed because of the proximity in terms of the time frame. You know, so you're actually able to be more specific as it becomes more of a reality. Another analogy that works really well with this is the car at night with the headlights. So, you know, you think about it that you have an idea, or there's that imagery outside of the headlight as to where you're heading. And as you're moving along, it becomes into clearer view. And so I think, you know, that's where it plays out. So you see a lot of organisations that are doing that, predominantly in the utilities, the infrastructure, government as a part of their role. That plays out very differently, as you can imagine, because they might have these aspirations, but a change of government could see some of that shift and change. But when it gets to the utilities and infrastructure, it can't change too radically because of the environment. Where it becomes a lot less longer term is in the products and the services. So, you know, your manufacturing. But even that one's an interesting one. If you think about car manufacturing, you've now got a lot of the car manufacturers that have identified particular years in which they will no longer be producing, you know, petroleum-based cars. So I think we're actually going to see more of that we're going to see more of organisations actually. That'll be part of the role that they will play in the ecosystem from a social impact point of view. I think that they'll start making more of these statements of a future perspective. So, yeah, I think it'll be a watch this space.
Yeah, and that was exactly what I thought this morning when I heard that news article, because I thought, well, really, there's leadership from an organisation regarding, because I'm an optimist. I firmly believe that humans are very adaptable and we will find ways to solve some of these problems. And I think there's an awful lot of expectation from our community that this stuff needs to be led by government, but government, hard to know what's going on in the machinations behind, but certainly what we see and hear on the news is pretty short-term thinking. There's not a whole lot of discussion of the 20, 30, 50, 100-year kind of vision. So can we rely on government or do we rely elsewhere? So it's lovely to hear and to think about, you know, the other leaders in our communities, like our employers, who are perhaps giving a bit more thought to some of the social impacts, the changes that they can make in that vision longer term.
I absolutely agree. I think the only thing that I caveat is sometimes they're putting these statements and these targets, and I'm not referring to the BP example here, but just more generally, that they're probably preferred targets. And so they've stayed in that world of this is what we'd prefer to be. And I'm actually going to segue and just position that the number of diversity and inclusion targets that I see in organisations, I quite often see them as being preferred. They're not necessarily probable, and in some instances not even plausible. And, you know, even the recent news cycle in regards to the government's Indigenous targets and, you know, only 2 of them being met, having worked with a number of organisations which had specific targets related to Indigenous, and they were passed down from government mandating, so they were state governments. They were targets that you just back of the envelope was going to tell you that it was not going to be achievable. They were in particular professions, and in order to complete or to be in this profession, you had to have a tertiary qualification. In order to have a tertiary qualification, you had to have completed school. Well, we just had to do the back of the envelope sums in regards to the numbers as to how many people were making through all of those stage gates, let alone this was for a particular profession, let alone just that broader finish school, finish tertiary education, not finish this particular qualification. There was no way those targets were ever going to be met. So again, that's why that those 5 Ps to me work in so many ways, because it's great to have a preferred future, but you then need to kind of check it in with that reality by looking at what's probable. And I'm not saying settle for what's probable, put some interventions and initiatives in place to stretch that probable, but you still got a plan. And I think that's just one of those caveats that plays out when we hear sometimes what those aspirations are of organisations when they're talking about the future.
And I wonder then whether there's actually another P in there around passion or purpose. Maybe it's two different Ps. But I'm thinking about this, when you were talking about that, it's like, well, are some of these targets, especially the ones that get publicised, are they more nice to have than have to? It's kind of this looks good. This is in keeping with what we, our corporate social responsibility plan. It's outwardly desirable, but do we really have a passion and purpose around making it happen? Because it's easy to say, but as you say, often not easy to do, and we can put it out there, but unless there's some passion and purpose to driving it to actually make it happen, then it's a bit lip service.
Absolutely. And I think this is why, in terms of futuring as an actual discipline, there's lots of dangers as to when people say, we're exploring the future, or they're building out scenarios, and they build out these wonderful stories of scenarios, but the pragmatic component of it's not there. So therefore people get a little lost and kind of say, well, that was a fun activity, but what am I going to do with this? Or, oh yes, well, we had aspirations for reaching this target and it didn't happen, so there's no point planning for the future. And as you just highlighted, it's what did I actually do in order to enable that future view? Right? It's well and good coming up with it, but where is the passion, the purpose, the plan for making it happen?
Yeah. And again, it parallels exactly the work you might do with an individual around, because this is all about change. So if we want to change, move to a point of change in the future, if we've got a goal or a target or something that we really, see that we want to do, or in some cases have to do, how do we actually get to that point? And again, so often I see the same thing with an individual. They say, I set myself a goal and I set a plan, and then it didn't happen because this happened or that happened, and so I gave up. Basically, they might not use that word, but that's essentially what happened. It was like, I decided that was pointless, and so I stopped. And trying to kind of work with that and say, but any kind of planning, any kind of change and movement, it's not just to set the thing and seamlessly move towards it. There's chopping and changing and movement and adaptability. And sometimes we go backwards before we can go forwards, but it's about finding that goal that does have that meaning behind it, that does have a sense of, this is something I really, really want to achieve, even though I know there's going to be obstacles, even though I know that there will be, in psychology, we talk about relapse as part of the change cycle because it's come out of alcohol and drug stuff. But we do, falling off the wagon in terms of achieving our goals is part of the process, and understanding that is really important if you're going to keep going.
Well, I think you've prompted me, that other P, prioritising. All of this and a lot of our structure and discipline is actually about prioritising. And as you said, if this is my goal and my passion and my purpose, then when other things happen in the environment, how do they fit in terms of the priority? You've got to reprioritise. And to me, someone who doesn't achieve what they might have planned to, it's because they prioritise something else at a particular point in time. And I'm not trying to make it binary and make it sound all easy, but that's what we're doing when we're making decisions. In actual fact, we're not making a binary decision with that's finite and specific. What we're actually doing is prioritising at a particular point in time, and prioritising that this is the effort that we're going to make on this. New information comes to light, and we kind of have to look at it and go, right, is that priority setting that I had before still valid and reasonable? Yes. No, might need some tweaking, not at all. And that's where we need to look at it. So maybe there's an underlying P. We'll have to call this the P talk, I think.
Yes, the P conversation. Tess, that brings me back really to that point, or what you're talking about earlier, about the need for adaptability and flexibility in all of this, that reprioritizing. And it's one thing to think about it as an individual, but when you're looking at an organisation and a leadership team, I can understand that new people come in and out. You get a new CEO and suddenly priorities change. They do change. So knowing that doesn't necessarily mean I'm guessing that that's the end of that plan. We throw it out the window. It might just be one of those inputs, a new input into the system that says, okay, we've got a new CEO. They've got a slightly different priority. As a group, are we still, from our purpose point of view, what we're trying to do, our contribution to our community in terms of providing work and employment for individuals, is that still in alignment with a bit of tweaking?
Yeah.
I'm guessing that's the kind of stuff you're dealing with then.
It is. And that one comes up a lot. And I suppose I position it that people that are in leadership positions typically are looking for the logic and the argument as to, well, why. So as I say to people, we're building a business case here for this particular planned future. And if you've done it in a way that said, this is what we explored, this is what we've prioritized, we actually did go through that process of understanding what's out there, broadening our horizons, and as a result, we identified this as an opportunity, and here's the why, where, what for. In regards to that, then the majority of leaders are going to look at that and understand it, and while they might have some refinement to it, it's unlikely that if there's the robustness there, they're to discard it. And I mean, that plays out, that was probably one of the most common ways I'd position it with government, when government officials or executive will say, look, it's all well and good, Tess, and we're going to put all our efforts in, but once new government comes in, and I just kind of look at it and go, but there's logic here. Now, I do appreciate that not everything's always logical. As I say,
especially not with human beings.
Not at all, no. And as you said, like that passion piece, there's something there. But I suppose what I'm suggesting is, rather than just accept that it could work with the vagaries of the person in the decision making, that there are things we can do to try and future-proof it a little bit. That we can actually be on the front foot to go, well, if I was someone new looking at this, what would I want to see in order to understand your thinking as to why you got to where you got to? Too often what we do is we say, here was the gap, this is how we're going to close it. We don't often actually tell the story as to why that gap is important. What's the impact to the organisation or to the services, to the products, to the community if this gap isn't closed? And what's the likelihood of this gap to actually occur? And when you start putting those two together and go, well, actually, it's a very high impact on us, our ecosystem, and it's really likely to occur, then it does start to build again that case to say, here's the reasons why this is something that's prioritised and planned for. So I suppose I'd kind of challenge all of our thinking for when we say, oh, but it could all change tomorrow. Of course it could. But we are dealing with people, and the majority of us are looking for logic for things. It doesn't mean that that's always our final decision maker, but majority of us will be open to seeing that with all our biases loaded onto that consciously and unconsciously. But we'll look at it, and I'm kind of saying, at least if we've got that, we've done our due diligence, rather than just saying, oh, look, someone could come in and change it all, so there's no point doing anything.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I can see that, in essence, something's either a good idea or it's not. And if it's a good idea, it should be robust enough to be able to withstand those sorts of changes. At its core, it might be tweaked. And if we've thought it through and we've used our logic and we've used our data and we've done our analysis and we've considered it from every option, then it should be robust enough to be able to withstand changes in leadership or changes in government, or even some of the, coming back to the individual, you can have an enormous blip in your life. You have a death or a significant illness or something really unexpected that throws everything out of the window short term or even medium term.
Yes.
But if you're coming from a place of, this is really what's important to me, this is core to who I am and where I want to be and what I want to contribute to the world, you will most likely come back to that path.
Agree. Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. So we've wandered all over the place. This has been a very exciting conversation. I'm conscious of the time already, so I'm really interested to know from you, Tess, thinking about this as a parent in particular, and we have a lot of parents who listen to the show. We've talked about the pie nature of careers.
Yep.
What is it, do you think, we need to be preparing our children for, the next generation, or even perhaps for ourselves if we're thinking we've got another 20, maybe 30 years of work ahead of us?
Yes, exactly. And constantly thinking about this. So one of the things that we all need, and it's there, but I do feel like anything, we need to nurture it, and that's our curiosity. When people say, oh, I don't like that sort of movie, or I don't
Yeah.
like, I just kind of really try to challenge. And I say, well, why not give one a go? One of the things I came across a good 10, 15 years ago was an article about how some of the ways that you can kind of challenge your unconscious biases. And they actually, because they did a lot of traveling, and at the time so was I, and at an airport, they would always buy a magazine of a topic that they didn't think they were interested in, right? So let's say
The woodworking magazine.
exactly right. Someone who might be a management consultant, who has a particular worldview of what they do, the theatre, the movies, the art, whatever, and they've got this construct, and then to actually buy the woodcrafting magazine, or to buy Men's Health when you're a female, that sort of thing, to challenge. And it's always stuck in my mind. It's a way of being able to stretch and practice our curiosity. And the lovely thing is that today we don't even have to do it with the investment of buying a magazine. I mean, it's about putting a word into our Google search and actually just going, I'm going to spend 15 minutes just exploring where this takes me. But picking a topic or a content that we just kind of go, I don't see myself being aligned with this. And I'm not saying we're taking a particular thing away from that, but we're building a muscle of curiosity and exploration. And there may very well be nuggets where we actually suddenly see that, actually, I have never thought of how that's related to something, which brings it into the Medici effect. There's a great book called The Medici Effect, and it's purely around the Renaissance area. And, we see it play out as to where you get inspired from fields that don't seem related. And a really simple example is, architects being inspired by nature, and the way in which looking at bees, for example, and the way that they kept the hives cool have now been incorporated into the way in which buildings are. So I think that's one of the things that we need to build in our children, that curiosity and nurture. And I know it all drove us insane when they were 2, and it was, but why? But why? But why? But can I say that there are some really well-paid people out in the world that get paid just asking why.
Asking questions.
Consulting business is purely, not purely, but a lot of it is actually getting organisations and people to reflect on the why. So although it drives us insane, I think we need to encourage the children just to keep asking us why.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I love that. Curiosity is actually one of my top 5. If I do the VS Strength Survey, curiosity is one of my top 5. And I often say that one of the things that has driven me not only to establish but to maintain this podcast, because, it's kind of additional work on top of the other work, is just because it absolutely plays to my strength of curiosity. I get to ask questions every week to a different expert in a different field, sometimes fields that I know very little about. And it always ends up, I learn stuff and I get inspired by stuff, and it opens my mind and my eyes to new things. So I love that, this idea that curiosity is something. But I think also it's a really excellent point. I think, and again, I'm sort of reflecting on contemporary society, I suppose. I think now one of the things I love about social media, for example, is that it allows us to curate our own news feeds. It allows us to create, but I think one of the risks in that is that it does actually start to limit, because we say, I only listen to psychology podcasts, or I only read this type of book, or I only need to see the stuff on my feed that already perhaps confirms my biases. I'm learning, I learn new stuff in my field, but is that too narrow? Do I need to actually broaden that out a bit, which I suppose is what used to happen if you flick through the old-fashioned newspaper.
Yes.
A headline might catch your eye on a topic that you know nothing about, and then you would read it and learn as a consequence. So I think that's an interesting dichotomy now for our modern digital age. Are we actually limiting our curiosity even though we can learn more?
And you beautifully took it where this conversation goes, in the fact that we need to consciously do this to disrupt what social media is feeding us. Because we like that tailoring. We love the net that says, you might also like this. Or,
yeah, I don't have to think about it, sure.
Exactly. You might also enjoy this book. Or it's great that it does do that tailoring, but we've also got to consciously trigger for some of the disruption to that thinking. Otherwise, I do feel our curiosity, while we might think, I'm reading so much and or experiencing so much, if we're not creating with thought, particular disruptions to those, then it's a degree of groupthink, but with an individual.
Yeah.
I think the other is organisations need to bake it into their mechanisms. So when I talk to organisations and we're exploring that futuring, I try to make sure that we're aware of who's involved in the process in the first example, and then kind of look for what's not represented. So a really simple example I give for here is executives. When I'm working with an executive leadership team, you've got to make sure people are comfortable in doing this, but basically finding out, well, who's tertiary qualified in the room? Ellen, unsurprisingly, the majority of them are. So my next question is, well, how would someone who hasn't been through a tertiary qualification be thinking about some of the things that we're discussing right now? And sometimes they're really open to actually saying, well, we need to get some of that thinking in here, and other times, a little less so. One group that I worked with, rather interestingly, had all the tertiary qualified. The majority of them actually came from the same university, and it was what we considered to be, a top university. So it came with prestige. And then delving a little bit further, the next majority, so I'm talking about 60% of this group of executive, actually all had studied the same discipline, so the same degree. And what gets even more alarming is that they had also pretty much studied under the same professors. Now, how, and this is where it links into curiosity, diversity of thought. So when we talk about diversity in organisations, we do tend to describe them with a number of the parameters or the characteristics of gender, cultural, age, socioeconomic. So I tend to say, look, let's think about what our diversity of thought is and how does that get represented here? And that actually brings it to be a number of characteristics. So if I seek diversity of thought, I'm not going to get that if they're all males. If I'm seeking diversity of thought, I'm not going to get that if they're all tertiary qualified or that they're all at a particular age band or they've only had experiences. The other I ask quite often is, what's the smallest organisation you've worked in through to the largest? And when you've got corporate people that have only ever worked in a corporate environment, but they're producing products and services for smaller businesses, it's a growth market. I mean, we know that. You and I, we're small business. How are they actually bringing that thinking in? So curiosity just beds down to this as being the skill. But I think there's a real skill in how do we actually help people explore their curiosity or their ways in order to be curious. And we've got the opportunity to do with our children, that we're constantly helping them understand how to be curious. And it's not just in the classroom. And we're all trying to make sure that's not only on the computers. There's that whole exploration of going to the park and finding the bugs. And
yes. And even I'm just thinking about my own boys and I love that their screen time. One of them's a keen basketball player. He's, I'm sort of partially monitoring what he's got on his screen. It's mostly watching NBA games. It's watching, players on TikTok. It's just all basketball, really. The other one, it's almost all Minecraft. So, they've got very different interests, but they are still just staying within those narrow fields. So now I'm thinking, well, I've got to get them. I'm actually going to go back to a bit of family TV time, maybe, and put stuff on. I know we watched a fantastic series with Annabelle Crabb, and I've forgotten what it was called, but she was looking at the way family meals were prepared over different generations, and it sparked a lot of interesting conversation for the family. So you've got me thinking about that. Aside from, I do often do that. Well, one of the questions, I don't know the answer. Let's Google it.
Yeah.
But thinking a lot about other ways in which we can create a bit of curiosity or more curiosity. And I love all of that stuff that you've just said about the diversity in organisations and diversity of thought and the fact, because for me, and I'm sure this is exactly the same for you as a consultant who works with lots of different organisations and workplaces, we get to see the diversity because we're going in from, we can look at the cultural diversity of a smaller or mid-sized manufacturing organisation versus a city council versus a large bank. But I sometimes forget that all those people in those systems, they're not going to all these other workplaces. They don't get to see how different it is.
Yes.
They're just in that ecosystem.
I couldn't agree more. Sorry. And I think you triggered when you were just speaking to the analogy of those different experiences you've had and are having. With the curiosity, I think part of it is that when we're at school, we get given questions and we get rewarded for having answers. And there's this finite kind of, oh, yes, that's a good answer, that's
it's the right answer or the wrong answer. Yeah.
Exactly. So part of our curiosity and some of the change that we need to, and this is really kind of leading into the future, ethics is playing such a big role in terms of, so again, you were saying, like, what are some of the skills? Philosophy and ethics, exploring is the other that I've really kind of crystallized, because anything that's got algorithms or logic can potentially be automated. Whereas, the future of work is about things that humans can do, right? And philosophy and ethics requires a lot of that human mind because it hasn't been experienced before. So when you're thinking about machines and machine learning, they're using the past and the present to be able to inform the future. If our future is significantly different from the data points they're able to collect from the past and the present, that makes it very hard for them to be able to do. So one of the things that us as humans, we're all about interpreting. So this comes into that curiosity, and the way in which we're doing it is actually about interpretation. So my kids are a bit older than yours, and by no means I'm not trying to say I'm a great parent, but a lot of that, when I reflect on our conversations, and they can get quite animated conversations, they're actually ethical ones about the future, about, or not necessarily, but right now, bioethics is a great example. If we were to manufacture a child with particular characteristics, is that something that's the right thing or the wrong thing? And you keep throwing factors into it. So I think it's almost becoming a little bit full circle. And when you think about education, it started with, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and the Socratic methods and the rest. I feel some of what we're talking to is how does that play out in today's world? Because we really closed it down a bit for a period there where you got asked a question and there was an answer. Whereas we're cycling back to actually it's absolutely okay that there's multiple answers and I need to make a choice.
And I think having spoken particularly to people who are working in the positive education field and looking at how we change schools up and the way we teach and the kind of environments we're cultivating within a school, I can see that starting to happen. They're probably right at the cutting edge. There'll be a bit of a lag, but I'm excited that they're filled with possibility. And I think, so that philosophy, just ideas, having, thinking about ideas, curiosity, ethics, and I suppose a bit of critical thinking in there too. Is this the only option? Are there other options? How else could we look at this? Are there other ways to answer this question, or all of those sorts of ideas? So it'll be very exciting to see. My kids will be finished school and yours already have, but it'll be exciting to see for future generations whether we do actually come full circle and come back to some of those exploration and ideas-based education rather than facts and right and wrong. It looks like if our coexisting systems are working properly and the organisations are starting to say these are the skills we need, and the schools are starting to say, just aside from, and I could go on and on then about, how these sorts of new ways of working are far more hopefully intrinsically motivating to individuals as well. I think we are driven to explore, we're driven to be curious. We want meaning and purpose in our work. We want change in our work, all of that sort of stuff I think is far more human than perhaps work has been at times. So we flip that into the system as well. The future looks pretty bright.
Yes, definitely. Agree.
Tess, thank you so much. There's a lot more I could ask you, and I'm even, I'm hatching little plans in my head to say we could have a whole other conversation just on that diversity topic, because I think that's fascinating as well. But I'm conscious of the time, and I've used up a lot of your precious time already. So thank you once again for a fantastic conversation, for your thoughtfulness around this. I'm sure that our listeners are going away inspired and motivated and curious to learn more and to think perhaps whether they're leaders in organisations themselves or just as individuals, about what some of the future possibilities might hold.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ellen. It was a great conversation. You prompted me to think, and it was a dialogue. We created new meaning. So thank you so much.
Are you curious about curiosity after that interview? What great tips from Tess. It really got me a little curious, and I found some great articles on particularly helping kids to become more curious. So those things we were talking about right at the end of the discussion there. And I've shared those in the show notes for this episode of the show. In the show notes, you'll also find some further tips from Tess, her contact details, a link to her LinkedIn profile, and of course, details of the PFAO Sydney 20 event where both Tess and I will be speaking. And that's all in the show notes for today's show. Pop over to potential.com.au/podcast. And while I'm talking about PFAO, a big thanks to Lara and Al and the team for partnering with Potential Psychology Podcast for this episode. If you'd like to find out more about PFAO, join their learning community or register for the Sydney event on the 3rd and 4th of March, you will find all the details and a link to register at pafow.net, PAFOW.net. And don't forget that special discount code either. It's SYD, SYD in capitals, 200. Now, should we take a look at next week? My next conversation on the show is about keeping our workplaces safe. Now, most of us have, sadly, at some time, had to deal with some pretty ordinary behaviour on the part of others at work. It might have been an inappropriate comment, it might have been discrimination, maybe some bullying. And if you've had the misfortune to be on the receiving end of any of this, you know how much it can destroy any goodwill that you might have towards your employer or workplace, not to mention messing with your confidence and maybe even your career. And next week, I'm going to be talking to Shiran Yaroslavsky, who is the co-founder and CEO of Cassiopeia. And Cassiopeia have developed some very clever technology that uses data from a workplace to pinpoint potential trouble spots in which this kind of offensive behaviour is more likely to occur. And then they're able to look for opportunities to basically foster a healthier and more inclusive work environment. So create the kind of team environment where this stuff just can't survive, let alone thrive. And as a workplace psychologist, I talk a lot to organisations and groups and leaders about psychological safety and our well-being at work. And this technology's got me really intrigued because I always think of, this is people behaviour. So where does technology and they're using artificial intelligence, where does that fit in? So I'm very intrigued. I'm going to pepper Shiran with all of my questions and see whether together we can uncover how to create even happier and healthier workplaces. So that's next week. It's episode 74 of the Potential Psychology Podcast. We are whizzing through this season. I cannot wait to bring you that conversation with Shiran and all the other excellent conversations that we have lined up for the remainder of the season. We've got everybody scheduled in. I'm feeling so organised. So I'm going to have to be patient. You'll have to be patient. But in the meantime, I want you to go forth and thrive and flourish and fulfil your potential.